Welcome to the fastest daf in town. Today we'll start this Menachot daf Sadi Hey. We're going to begin at the very top of Sadi Hey Amud Aleph, the first line. So we were learning in yesterday's daf that when it comes to the shulchan, exactly what did the lechem apanim look like, or the defus, the form or mold in which held the lechem apanim, the 12 showbreads. It was either a flat box, kiminteva perusa. As you can see, a picture of it on the top of Sadi Dalad Bays. Alternatively, it looked like a Sfina Rokedes. It looked like a V, like a boat. And therefore, because of that, there was a whole dispute exactly how were the Kanim placed, how were the Sanifim placed, etc. So, Meisve, Kamin Kaveres Hayelo Betanur. Comparable to a Kaveres, like a basket. It was in the oven. V'daimik kimin tavla mervas. And it says it looks like it was squared. Now, what does that mean? So it's pretty clear, the fact that it says this, that it sounds that like the opinion that it's squared out and not like a V-shaped, that it's a Sfina Rokedes. So it sounds pretty clear like that. So Ema Upia, maybe at its top, the opening is daimik kimin tavla mervas. So even though it's true that if we're dealing with the lechem panim, which is V-shaped like this, but at the very top, that is something which looks like squared off at the top. It's wide and squared off. Not the bottom, but maybe the top. Okay, so that's basically the way to get out of that answer. So Tanya Kamandi Emer Kimin Sfina Rokedes. This, and I'll prove to you a brisa that supports the lechem apanim actually were created in a form which looked like this V, like this boat. The Sanya arba sinifim shel zav sham. There was actually 4 of these sinifim, which we mentioned. The sinifim are on each side of the shulchan that were vertical supporters that stood alongside the lechem, and it supported again the bread, and it had notches that supported the kanim that ran across under each loaf. Okay, so Hayusham Mefulsin Broishehem Kimin Dikarnin Kimin Dikarnin Hayush Smuchim Behenes Alechem. Okay, so let's go see if Rashi helps me over here. Not really. Kimin, okay, Shehu Daimik Kimin Sfina Rokedes. And it says explicitly over here that these breads looked like a Sfina Rokedes. So it's kind of hard to disagree that it clearly have a support, at least over here, that that's what it looked like. So Iboihu. Now the Gemara asks a totally different question. Lechem apanim nifsil b'masois o enu nifsil b'masois. So as Rashi says, they were traveling around all the time. They had to assemble the Mishkan and then dismantle it and then travel. Now, during that time, the breads that were taken off, so are they puzzle b'yaitse? Because it has to remain in the Mishkan. But when you dismantle it and yet there's bread, does that bread become puzzle b'yaitse? So Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, Chad over nifsol, v'chad over eno nifsol. So it's a machlokas, at least for the time being. So Mandi over nifsol. The reason why he says it's considered yaitze, like the pasuk says kasher yachanu, just as they encamped, kain yisu, so they would travel. So ma b'chinasai, just like while they're encamping, it's possible that nifsol be yaitze. Av ben siyaso nifsol be yaitze. It's possible that you could be puzzle be yaitze, and it makes sense. Again, if there's no Mishkan, everything was already dismantled, that the lechem apanim are considered to be puzzle because it's no longer in the Mishkan, because the Mishkan is dismantled. So, Mandi Enu Nifsol, the Chsev has different pasuk. The lechem atamid yeh, it says that the lechem will continuously be on it. So, V'idach nami haksev kasher yachnu kein yisau, which apparently should mean that no matter what, there's a psul yaitse, just like while the Mishkan's there, if you take the breads out, certainly there's a psul yaitse. So too when it comes to when you're traveling. So idach gisa, you can actually flip it around and say it this way: Ma b'chinaso ki lo yatzim im kainol misol. just like when it comes when you're the Mishkan's there, if you don't take the breads off the shulchan, then it's not going to passel. So so as long as they stay on the shulchan, even though there's no Mishkan anymore, because, well, at least now, because this was dismantled, but at least you'll keep the shulchan intact, you'll keep the breads there, and therefore maybe there won't be a psul yaitze there. So it sounds like it must be kosher, and there's no din yaitze. The truth is, if the lechem apanim are on the shulchan, as Rashi says, al shulchan, then in that situation, no one's going to argue. Everyone will say that you're okay. There's no psul yaitze because they are where they were supposed to be. Elaki plig b'masuluk. Maybe we're only talking about a situation where they were already removed and they just didn't eat it yet. So mandiar menivsol, why is it possible that kashiyachno ken yisu says iser of yaitze? So man b'chinasai, just like when it's removed outside during the time when the Mishkan is standing, nisel b'yaitze. So nisel b'yaitze. So mandiar eno nivsol dechsev nasa oyel moyed avol misha nasa ol moyedhu. That even though they're traveling, it still has a din of a Mishkan, and therefore the reality is that there's no din yaitze. So idach gisu, you can say the other way around. Ma b'chinaso, when it's coming to the time when the Mishkan is around, ki lo mapik le lo mifsol. If you don't take it off, it's not going to pass. So often the siyaso ki lo mapik le lo mifsol. It's not going to be a problem, even while it's traveling, as long as the breads are there. So no, the golem hudasa. That's just telling you which camp went first in their travels. You could only learn from there. So Meisvei. So the Gemara is not satisfied with this so far. This machlokas. It says b'shas siluk, at the time when they're traveling, removing everything. So masois kadoshim nifsul b'yoytze. So we say in the travels, all the kadoshim, all the karbanos are pasul b'yoytze. Says Rashi, she'ein lehem kiloim, because there's no curtain there. V'alfal pikein hamachane kadosh, the machane is kadosh. V'zavnim atzarayin mishtalchen chutz mechitzasai. They still have to leave the various camps. Mitzarah chutz l'machane Yisrael. The Mitzarah has to go outside, technically all three camps, but again, if they're traveling, they have to leave Machane Yisrael. V'hoyu mahalchim b'seif machane, and they would have to travel in the back, as it's brought down Masechtas Brachos. Es vahi b'sufa v'zovin chutz l'machane lavia. So they actually, the Gemara over there talks about different nisim that took place in the 9th parak in Brachos, and es vahi b'sufa, these two people who were traveling in the back. That's what it says here. So my lav afil lechem upon him. So probably also lechem upon him also become possible yaitze. Whoa, bar lechem upon him. Not that. The lechem upon him will not become possible yaitze. So madrashach, understand. I omoid davka hu afil kadashim nami. I omoid lav davka hu afil lechem upon him nami. So you can't split hairs over here. Either there's an issue of lechem upon him, or there's and kachim, or all karbanos, or not. So El Akiyasa Rabbi Mar, he says like this. Mar Omar b'masudar umar omer b'masulak v'lo pligi. So this is actually the Maskana Sagamara. The truth is, there's no machlokas at all. While you're traveling, as long as the breads are still on the shulchan, then that's it. Then it's not going to be an issue. It won't be possible yaitze. However, once they're taken off while you're traveling, then it becomes psul b'yaitze. So Amar Rabbi Shemamina yesh silk ma'asois b'layla. It says there you could take this traveling at night. Now these agadaitach in silk ma'asois b'layla. If you want to tell me they cannot be taken off during the night, for look at Rashi. Shim hoyanal ha'anan b'layla. If let's say the cloud goes up at night, hayadaisim yad, they start traveling. Lo hayamamtinan on a bike. They didn't wait until the next morning. So if you want to tell me in silk masois balad, they would not travel at night with these clouds. So amos medali lasafra. So when they would roll the curtain in the morning, my iri mishum yaitse. Typically, the ifsale belina, right? There should be an issue of lina itself. Look at Rashi. Amos midalu kalim. When do they move up these curtains? So Belayla, it says Belayla, lo matzi akri. Dichsiv yomim bereishim ahadu layla. Okay, so basically they would wrap them up, and then all of a sudden there should be already an issue of being psulbalina, right? So we don't say there's a psulbalina as long as, again, the breads are still there. So there's no isser of yaitse either. Okay, question 5. So shar karbanos, yes, all kadshi kadashim are possible yaitse. However, when it comes to lechem, as long as it's b'masudar, b'mkaimulu nifsal. However, b'masuluk nifsal. In that case, then it would become possible. So that is the din, which means really a maskana. It's not. There's no machlokas. Question TB 17. Ha'im lechem apanim nisal mas b'shas siluk masais. Or ima lechem kisidron hainu adayin al shulchan az enu nifsal. Aval ima lechem lo al shulchan az nifsal b'yaitse kimo shar karbanos. Okay, that's a pretty good answer. That's TB 17. Okay. All right. Right. So the pshita. So again, it's obviously at night they would travel. What was the whole question? Of course, it says they would travel at night. What was this whole question? So you would think only if they removed the curtain during the day. If they didn't do it during the day, they wouldn't start their journey at night. Kamashmon. Raminhu, I'll ask you a question. When they would roll up the curtain, then all of a sudden all these people were able to go there, which means they didn't leave the machana. You told me they left the machana. Clearly they didn't. When it came to the travels. So Eliezer Harabana. It's actually a machlokas. The sign is we continue to Sadi Hamid Beis. Rabbi Eliezer Oimer Yachol Dochu Zavim Masarayim. You would think if the Zavim and the Masarayim would push themselves, and they would enter into the Azara, you would think that they are violated. Talmud Leimer v'yishalchu min hamachana kol tzurua v'chol zav v'chol tamid l'nefesh b'shah shetamei meisim mishtalchin zavim mitzrayim mishtalchin in tamei meisim ein tamei meisim mishtalchin ein zavim mitzrayim mishtalchin. So basically, in a time where there was the majority of the people were tamei, they were bringing carbon pesach. So if they pushed themselves in, they're not going to be chayev, even though they're not supposed to come in zav and mitzrayim. But since we link a zav and a mitzrayim to someone who is tamei meis, but in this case, as Rashi alpha pi shetamei meisim imishtalchin, you would think that since they don't get sent out, zav and mitzrayim mishtalchin, we still would send them out. However, the pasuk says v'yishach min hamachne kol tzurua v'chol zav v'chol tamid nefesh. So what do we learn out from this pasuk? B'shah at the time shetamei meisim mishtalchin, then zav and mitzrayim mishtalchin. Right. However, ein tamei meisim mishtalchin, ein zav and mitzrayim mishtalchin. So if they're doichek v'nichnas, then we don't say that they're going to be chayav. At least according to this opinion. Okay. Says the Mishnah. Achas shtei halechem. Whether we're talking about the shtei halechem on Shavuos, the achas lechem upon him that go on the shulchan. Lishasan, it's kneading, very chasan, and it's forming b'chutz. That should be done outside of the azara, v'afiyasin b'fnim. However, the actual baking process, as the Gemara is going to explain, should be done inside. The einon doiches is the Shabbos. However, the baking of the breads are not doiches Shabbos. We know that a lot of karbanos we shecht in the Beis HaMikdash, but we don't bake these things in the Beis HaMikdash on Shabbos. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, kol ma'asein b'fnim. No, actually, everything is done inside, not just the baking, but also the kneading and the forming. Rav Shimon Omer Oyulam Havi Ragel Omer, he was accustomed to say that Shtei Lechem Lechem Apanim Ksheris Ba'Zara, the Kshera B'Beis Pagi, that it was kosher in the Azara and also in the base Pagi, which says Rashi, which is B'chol Yerushalayim, the Kosavar Afiyasin Nami B'chutz. He actually held that the baking was also outside. So we have this machlokes, is the baking inside, the outside, the forming. What exactly is going on over here? So let's see. So Haguv Kasha. Seemingly, we have a direct contradiction. First of all, it says that the kneading and the forming are done outside. Alma midas yavesh lo niskacha. This is a whole machlokas when it comes to kli, which is for dried items, right? For example, the isaron, that it doesn't sanctify, it doesn't create kedushas aguf when something's put into it. V'fiyasin bifnim. However, we have to do the baking inside, alma midas yavis niskacha, because the problem is that if it becomes kedushas aguf and it's outside, it's already becomes possible yaitze. So while it's being baked in the oven, that's what creates it, according to this opinion, for it to develop kedushas aguf, and therefore it has to be done inside. Because if it's done outside and it's baked that way, then it automatically loses. It's not kosher anymore because it's possible yaitze. So Meralba. So Hiksha, he had to answer this. Adam kasha shehu kasha kabarzel, a difficult individual, which is as hard as this very difficult question, which is a very sharp person, which is sharp as a metal. Uman Rav Sheshis, my kasha dilma isaron mekadesh tanur mekadesh. I don't understand. What's this whole question to begin with? Oh, it's such a difficult stira. What do you mean? Maybe this is the point, that when it comes to kneading, when it comes to forming, it can be done outside, because the fact that it's done in a kli is not mekadesh, because it's a midas yavesh. However, the oven is mekadesh, and that's why it has to be inside. It's not a hard question. So it says that we have to bake inside. Why? It must be alma tanur mekadesh, right? And therefore, as I said, because it's kedushas aguf, once it develops kedushas aguf, so if it's outside, then it's possible. It's already possible yaitze. However, the question is then, why does it say in daichas Shabbos? So if solobelina, then it doesn't make sense. If in fact you have to bake it on Friday and it's baked and it develops kedushas aguf, so then you can't wait the next day. It has to be done on Shabbos, because if it develops kedushas aguf at the time of the baking and you bake it before, then that night it becomes possibilina. Says Rashi, the chol menachot shniskanshu b'kli. Once it becomes sanctified, nifsalim. V'hai kivan liakdish me'esmo b'tanur. You baked it in the oven on Friday. Zivso belina. Kanim sheyisidu al shulchan, before you put it on the shulchan on Shabbos. So that's the problem. Well, there should be an issue of lina. So Elam Rava Hiksha Adam Kasha Shehu Kasha Kabarzel, a very difficult person, very hard as rock, the very difficult question. Mona Rav Shesha. So Rav Ashi, my kusha. Again, what? That's not a question. Dilma my mifnim, but makam's reason. It doesn't mean necessarily inside. Says Rashi Vilba Zara Mamish El B'chutz. Maybe you should bake it outside. And the Kohanim or Zaras, they just want to make sure it doesn't become chametz, right? Because it has to remain as matzah. But it doesn't mean it was bifnim, because you're right, if it was bifnim and it was done on Friday, it becomes possibilina. But maybe it was baked outside, and therefore it did not take upon itself any sanctity. This doesn't make sense. If you need to bake it, if you need, again, the Kohanim to be all there and doing all the stuff, so then what's the difference between the baking and all the other steps before it? It shouldn't matter. It's a question. It's a mistake. Question 6. Mehem beis hanafke midas hamaskar gemara b'pluta. The Rebbe Rav Shimon im tanur mekadesh tehalechem or shulchan mekadesh. What's the difference if it's the oven or the shulchan? So as we said, if you do the baking inside or outside, because if the oven is mekadesh it, then you have to do the cooking inside. And the question is also if the afiyah is doicha Shabbos. If it's doicha Shabbos, it should be doicha Shabbos if it develops kedushas aguf from the oven. Okay, but maybe it's only once it's put on the shulchan, and therefore that's the reason why there's no issue of lina, because it doesn't develop kedushas aguf until you put it onto the shulchan. Okay. Question TA 14. Shtei lechem afiyasim bifnim. Right, it's done inside, right, inside the azara. But it's not doicha Shabbos. But Gemara Mavor to have you tarte de sasri. Why is that a tarte de sasri? Okay, so we already said this. So the answer is because if you do it inside, it means that the tanur is what's mekadosh, right? So it gives it kedushas aguf, right? So therefore, if that's the case, it should be doicha Shabbos, right? If it's done on Friday. If it's done on Friday, so then it's going to be a psubalina. That's TA 14. Okay. All right. That may end up being the last question for today. Okay, so let's finish this up. Rabbi Yehuda Omer Kol Masein Bifnim. Rabbi Yehuda said in this Mishnah that everything was done inside, right? Which is mashma. So Rabbi Shimon Omer Oilam Havi Ragul Omer. So our Mishnah said, Rabbi Yehuda Omer Kol Masein Bifnim. Everything's done inside, the baking, but also the kneading, everything. So Rabbi Boy Bar Kahana V'Shneim Mikra Echad Darshu. The machlokus of where it's done b'fnim b'chutz is, which is all totally if it's doicha Shabbos, is based on the same pasuk. It says in Sefer Shmuel Aleph, v'hu derech choyel afki hayomi kaddish b'kli. So this is referring, as Rashi says, it was be'erev Shabbos, it was on Friday. Ashkachinhu David, he found the Kohanim that they were baking, right? So the question is, what exactly was happening? So Yehuda Omer b'chol ashkachenu, he found them on a Friday to ka'afole that he was baking. So Amar Lahu, so David Melech said to them, derech choyel ka'afisu. What you're doing is you're baking like weekday, right? Afole. Afki hayomi kaddish b'kli. You're going to be mekadosh with a kli if solei belina. So understand, how could you take this lechem upon him and bake it on Friday? You're going to be mekadosh it with a kli. It's going to develop kedushas aguf, and therefore from that point you can't use it the next day. It's possible ina. So that's one pshat. Reb Shimon Savar b'Shabbos kashchenu. No, it was actually on Shabbos. David Melech, who was speaking to Nov Yoran Kohanim, to these 85 Kohanim, I believe it was 85, who ended up being killed by Doicha Daimid because he supported him, as we're going to see. The Ko'afule, they were baking on Shabbos. So apparently, right? So Amrulahu lo derech choyel b'isul amivdei. Like basically, what's going on? You're baking on Shabbos. You need to actually do it on a weekday. Midi tanor mekadesh. It's not the tanor that's mekadesh it, and therefore that's why you had to bake it on Shabbos, because if you baked it on Friday, it'd be psulina. Shulchan hu the mekadesh. It's the shulchan. So therefore, until Shabbos, when you don't put it on until Shabbos, so it's not a problem. So why would you don't bake it on Shabbos? What are you doing, right? So you want to tell me you found them when they were baking? There's no bread, upon him. There was nothing, no food except for the lechem upon him. What was he saying? This is what David Melech was saying. There's nothing here except for the lechem upon him, which are given over to Hashem. So Amalahu Loma boy hi the kivan de navikli mamiyula derechayilhu. So says Rashi, the kivan shesilkai, once you remove it, mutal kohanim, a kohanim could eat it. V'chol sheish loishas heter kohanim ein lo miyula. You don't have to worry about the issue of miyula over here because it's already been taken off. Elafilu hechnami the yomi kaddish b'kli. Even if you want to tell me that it was sanctified on the shulchan, So havil deleichel. You should still give it to me to eat anyway. What do you mean? It's an iser me'ilah. Sadi vel munalf. Masukenhu, says Rashi, she'achsu bulmus. David HaMelech developed this illness of bulmus, which is brought down also in the Mishnah in Yoma, which affects the eyesight. And the only way you can remove that is by eating, as Rashi says. So you feed them until their eyesight comes back. So Masukenhu. Rabbi Yehuda Rav Shimon Begemar Pligi. One says Rashi Mar Gomerle Merabi. One learns from his teacher the Tanor Mekadesh. One says it was not Mekadesh. They can have the Tanor Rav Shimon Omer Oyom Havi Ragel Loimer Shtei Lechem Lechem Aponim Ksheris Bazar Ksheris a base Pagi Shma Mina. So what's the proof? The Gemara that they're only arguing on the Gemara on logic and not on psukim. The fact that he says, I'm always ruggled to say this. Why didn't you're ruggled to say it? Called a pasuk. Must be because it's not based on a pasuk.